This is Billy Kay with The Declaration, Programme 2, April 6th.
I'm standing amidst the huge skyscrapers of 6th Avenue in Manhattan and recalling these words from US Senate Resolution 155 in 1998. April 6 has a special significance for all Americans, and especially those Americans of Scottish descent, because the Declaration of Arbroath, the Scottish Declaration of Independence, was signed on April 6, 1320, and the American Declaration of Independence was modelled on that inspirational document. Today is April 6, and I'm here for a distinctively American celebration of Scottish heritage. Welcome to Tartan Day in New York City.
Ancestry is partly Irish and partly Scottish, so I celebrate both traditions and I'm just happy to have an opportunity to come and join with everybody today. There's such a joyous spirit today.
Well, I have a lot of Scottish blood in me, and that means I like the pipes, and that means I like a parade, and that means I love Scotland, you know?
What are you doing here, girls?
We're lawyers, the Bar Association. We're all Scottish lawyers. We live here, so it's so nice to be surrounded by Scottish people again.
People like Henry Lafayette Collins and former Lord Provost of Edinburgh, Eric Milligan.
I reckon there's 8 Scottish universities represented here. We didn't have that when we started.
How many parades have you been on, Eric?
This is the 20th in 1999. I managed to get Visit Scotland to give me £5,000 to bring the Lothian Borders Police Pipe Band with me, and that was the start of it. And I've got to say to you, the reason why I do it is because I love being here in New York, particularly when you're making a statement on behalf of Scotland.
Oh yeah, I mean, if you believe everything the Scots say, nothing would have happened here without them. St. Andrews, of course, is a wonderful organization that does so much good charitable work, etc.
It's a great day for Scottish American heritage. We're so proud of what the Scots who came to America did for New York City and for America in general.
And is it a profound heritage? Did we do a lot?
Profound heritage. My great ancestor signed the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, Sir Alexander Strahan. So I'm very proud to be here as part of his.
Come a wee bit closer.
Anne Strayton Pearson.
And how long have you known about your connection to the Declaration of Arbroath?
Oh, a long, long time. It's something that's passed down in family lore. You know how it is. Your great-granny tells you, your great-grandpa tells you. Oh, I was told that one of our great ancestors signed a very important document in the history of the world for the rights of man, and I had to go find it. Went to Montrose Library in Scotland, looked it up, found him, and saw a copy, facsimile copy of the Declaration. So.
And what was it like to see your name there?
Oh, I cried. It was amazing. It's a really incredible thing.
Have you any feelings of the Declaration of Arbroath? Is it something that you're aware of? Tell me.
Very much so. No, the Declaration of Arbroath was for freedom, of course, but it was just the getting together of a nation.
We're on the parade now, and we're turning out of the shade of 44th Street and just waiting to turn into the amazing sight of 6th Avenue with these huge skyscrapers left and right, and thousands lining the side of the road and cheering. Thousands of saltires, thousands of people supporting the Scots.
But what was it like to lead the parade as Grand Marshal? Actor Brian Cox.
You did feel part of something which was ultimately bigger than yourself. You know, we're very good at parties. We like parties. So it's another means of celebration, and it was very exciting being the Grand Marshal and walking up the head of my 2 wee boys and my wife, walking up 6th Avenue, and you did have a sense of legitimacy, you know, that that's what the Scots have always suffered from, was we've always felt slightly illegitimate.
What are your feelings about being a Scot in America?
It's like, I think it's a bit like winning the lottery ticket, actually. I think we're very lucky. Everybody seems to have some kind of connection to Scotland, one way or the other. So I feel very lucky, actually. I became a citizen a few years ago, but I'll go to my grave a Scot.
Proud Scottish New Yorker Alistair Nicholl, and representing the Scottish Parliament there were MSPs Liam MacArthur and Linda Fabiani.
Today I met constituents walking down 6th Avenue, but every so often Liam would see an Orkney flag and run away to say hello to people, and I would hear some very West of Scotland voice screaming my name. It feels like a home from home. It's great.
It was a spectacular sight, but I don't think there was a part of Scotland that wasn't represented in some shape or form.
What does a day like this mean to you?
Proud. Quite proud because my son and daughter there are playing in one of the bands, so we're quite happy. North Lanarkshire schools, so
Very
it's
good.
a proud moment for us.
What a sight looking back
It's
there.
amazing.
Thousands and thousands.
It's amazing. It'll be quite emotional, I think. It's a great moment for everybody.
Easy a smile that makes you want to greet at the same time.
Definitely.
I'm proud of New York. I'm proud of my Scottish roots. I'm proud of my Puerto Rican roots. But I think at the end of the day, what this does is it offers us an opportunity to acknowledge that different identities are important. Just talk about New York City. One of our major institutions is Carnegie Hall. And there are countless examples of how Scots have influenced New York in engineering, architecture, the arts, the sciences. I think we should be proud of that, and I think that we need to spend a good amount of time every year remembering it, and this is a perfect way to do that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
All right. Great to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Dan.
Thank you.
Nice.
Dan McSweeney. And during Tartan Week, the Scottish Government hosted cultural events such as Global Scotland in Carnegie Hall, with Marjorie Harper of Aberdeen and Graham Morton of Dundee University. Speaking to them, I recalled Sir Walter Scott's description of the Declaration as that spirited manifesto that should have been written in letters of gold.
If we look behind us, we see the statue to Robert Burns sitting opposite the statue to Walter Scott in Central Park. And we try and understand the Scottish identity as it formed in different parts of the diaspora. And I think we have to be careful to understand Scottishness in the diaspora as being something different from Scottish identity that we find at home.
Tell me about the background to Tartan Week.
At the time I worked in Canada, certainly the Canadians have a great interest in Tartan Week. Mrs. Jean Watson in particular coming over and persuading the federal government in Canada to celebrate this. A little bit disappointed, I believe the Americans got there in first and making it a day of celebration.
The idea came down from north of the border to celebrate Scottish contribution around the world, in particular Canada. So it came down, and thanks to Senator Trent Lott and a couple of others in Washington, D.C., it was managed to be put through as a Senate Resolution 155 in March 1998. It then got promoted through the House of Representatives in 1998, and then in 2005 George W. Bush made it a presidential proclamation. And Tartan Day, the concept has spread around the world as well, but it's very specific to America and to New York, and we're very, very proud of that.
The 6th of April being chosen because it was the date on which the Declaration of Arbroath was signed in 1320. And the link that was made by Senator Lott and others was with the Declaration of Independence, that he, in his resolution, drew a straight line between the philosophy that supposedly inspired the Declaration of Arbroath and the philosophy that inspired those who drew up the Declaration of Independence.
The 155 Senate resolution was March 1998, and Tartan Day is April. Well, there wasn't enough time to have a parade a month later. So the first parade was the next year. And it was, you say, 3 man and a dug, because you didn't need a police permit if you walked up the sidewalk. Yes, it would only be a couple of hundred people walking up the street in 1999. Now we have between 2,500 to 3,000 marchers and 25 to 30,000 observers in the crowds.
I guess the first parade that I actually came to see rather than actually be in was when Sean Connery was the Grand Marshal. Absolutely exciting. There were almost 10,000 pipers on the street, and I swear to you, he looked right into my eyes.
We had an event on the steps of Capitol Hill. Dignitaries were there, Sir Sean Connery, and the Vice President, Dick Cheney, heard that something fun was happening on the steps of Capitol Hill, so he came down and joined us. That was April 2001, and then 2002 we came back to New York. We have stayed ever since.
I feel that it is an American holiday that's for Scots and Scots Americans and their contribution to the building of the United States. There's no absolute proof, we wrote the Declaration of Independence based on the Declaration of Arbroath, but we believe it's so.
What Scotland wanted to do, leaving English rule is the same of people that immigrated here to this country. They wanted to leave English rule. They didn't want English rule anymore. They wanted to be themselves. Our holiday is April 6th, and we try to recognize that every year, celebrating the 1320 signing of the Declaration of Arbroath.
Have you ever read the Declaration of Arbroath? Is it something that resonates with you?
I haven't read all the text of it, apart from the famous line about there's 100 of us, which always struck me as quite pragmatic, that they went with 100 so they got a fighting chance rather than 10 or 1. I thought, well, that's very Scottish of them. Yes, that resonates.
Yes, till fewer than 100 of us remain. I've quoted that to friends in England and they all laugh, but I mean it.
On that day, when I think of what went before, that long ago in 1320, when they're saying, if as long as 100 of us are alive, that's what April 6th means to me.
Leslie McLennan Denninger, Margaret Kennedy and Kyle Dawson, organisers of Tartan Day past and present, and Professor Hector McQueen of Edinburgh University on those famous lines. But what happened to the Declaration of Arbroath between 1320 and the American Declaration of 1776? In the days before printing, how was it kept alive and by whom? David Brown of Glasgow University.
This is about people throughout the Middle Ages at that level of high literate society, Latinate society, engaging with this document as part of Scottish history. It was copied because it was integrated into the standard history of Scotland written in Latin at the time. Therefore, it was copied by umpteen scribes. And there is one context. It is the most thoroughly worked out and coherent statement of Scottish history that's referred to unhelpfully as the Book of Plunged. Afraid the author is unknown. Completed their work in 1461, and he's a really creative character. And what he does, when he gets hold of any document, he will rewrite it. Now, the only document that he includes twice is the Declaration of Arbroath. The deposition clause, interestingly, is rewritten to emphasise that it's going to be a unanimous verdict to get rid of the king and to elect another. And then the passage preceding it, that's rewritten to emphasise that the king is elected unanimously.
There's a text of the Declaration of Arbroath preserved in Walter Bower's Scotty Chronicon, which is a great history of the Scots that was written in the 1440s by Bower, a churchman. And that shows certainly that still in the 15th century the Declaration was known about and could be embodied in this very patriotic history of Scotland.
So what I'm working on is having a thorough look at the 26 manuscripts which can be located in Scotland in the Middle Ages. And what you find is that they really do engage with it. It's also how they punctuate it, remembering that punctuation is thinking about how it's going to be said. So, for example, the bits which are giving a wee list of the terrible crimes of Edward I, that's often punctuated for emphasis. So, all in all, you do get immediately a sense of this as a living text.
But by the 16th century and the time of the Reformation, it appears to disappear from Scottish consciousness for a while, a situation that changed dramatically when it was finally printed in the 17th century. Roger Mason of St Andrews University.
There are certainly people who are thinking and writing in a tradition of kind of radical political thinking, and you can put together a sort of genealogy from John Mayer, John Knox, George Buchanan, Samuel Rutherford, Fletcher of Saltoun. All these people arguably were tapping into these sorts of ideas. Even someone like George Buchanan, who wrote his History of Scotland in the 1580s, absolutely determined to prove the point that kings are accountable to their subjects in order to justify the overthrow of Mary Queen of Scots. Buchanan doesn't refer to the Declaration of Arbroath. He doesn't appear to know of its existence. It doesn't mean that these radical political ideas weren't around, but it does mean that you can't actually link them directly to the kind of iconic Declaration of Arbroath.
Discovered in Tyningham House in the Earl of Haddington's property in East Lothian in the 1670s. It appears in Latin in 1680, published by George Mackenzie, an ardent royalist and subsequently King's advocate.
Founder of the National Library too.
Founder of the National Library, yeah.
He first has it printed in a book about precedency, largely for the purpose of supporting an argument that was being hotly debated at the time about Scottish independence from England. And Mackenzie, like most Scots, was adamant in his belief that Scotland was an independent kingdom and always had been. And he uses the Declaration of Arbroath to argue that this is evidence that the Scottish kingdom would not allow Bruce or any other king to alienate the kingdom. It wasn't his personal possession, it was an independent kingship, and it had to remain as such.
And then it's published in English and translation in 1689. It goes then through several more editions, about 4 or 5, before the Union of 1707. So in the run-up to 1707, it starts to be used as part of the debate about the Union.
Murray Pittock of Glasgow University, indeed. This was the Duke of Atholl in the Scottish Parliament on November 4th, 1706. Who much are we declined from those of our predecessors, who in their letter to Pope John said though so long as there were 100 Scotsmen alive, they would never subject themselves to the English. I think we should say too, so long as there are 100 of us alive, we will not enter into a treaty so dishonourable and entirely subversive of us as this is.
And the Declaration also been highlighted in Walter Goodall's 1759 edition of Scottish Chronicon. And Goodall was a strong Marian, that is, he was an advocate of Mary Queen of Scots. And that was a phenomenon in 18th century Scotland which you can call false loyalism. That is, you show your support for the Stuarts and ending the Union by supporting a Stuart who is dead and relatively safe. But Boswell's use of it is perhaps most notable, and he sees it from the point of view of being a Scots baron from a Scots baronial family and the representative quality that the barons have for the nation of Scotland as a whole, and how many of the barons have ceased to be true Scots. And the Earl Marshal particularly compliments Boswell on being a true Scot from south of Tay, of which he believes there are very few left.
Often in his journals, when he records his conversations with the exiled Jacobites, for example at Avignon, one of the exiled Jacobites there, Lord Dunbar, asks him, were the people of Scotland reconciled to union? And Boswell reported, alas, my lord, they are. All virtue and independence have left us.
Boswell's like many people right through the imperial period. Fundamentally, he sees the advantages of the Union, but he regrets the Scotland he's lost.
When he was on the Grand Tour, he went to the University Library in Leipzig with some local scholars, and he was delighted to find that among their collection was a book called Anderson's Diplomatica Scotiae, which was a collection of Scottish diplomatic documents. And he drew their attention to the Declaration of Arbroath. And what he says in his journal is this: my old spirit got up. I read them some choice passages of the Baron's letter to the Pope. They were struck with the noble sentiments at the liberty of the old Scots, and they expressed their regret at the shameful union. I felt too patriot sorrow. O infamous rascals, who sold the honour of your country to a nation against which our ancestors supported themselves with so much glory. But I say no more, only, alas, poor Scotland.
The late Paul Henderson Scott and Edinburgh University's Alec Murdoch. In America, Boswell became famous for his book, An Account of Corsica, the journal of a tour to that island and memoir of Pascquale Paoli. First published in 1768, it was hugely popular in the American colonies. Alex Murdoch recalled that a street in his native Philadelphia was named after the Corsican freedom fighter Paoli because of the success of Boswell's book at the time. Well, the very first thing you see when you open that book are the famous words from the Declaration of Arbroath. We fight not for glory, nor for wealth, nor honours, but only and alone we fight for freedom.
When he writes about Corsica, he quotes from the Declaration of Arbroath. And the language that he and Marshall use in discussing Scotland and the nature of Scotland is conscious of the language and the attitudes of the Declaration.
In Berlin, when he looks up the Earl Marshal, who'd been a Jacobite officer in the 1715, when he meets Marshal, they agreed that the House of Stuart had fallen into decay. Yet Boswell in great detail writes how the Earl Marshal, George Keith, gave him a copy of The Life of Bruce and said that every true Scot should read The Life of Bruce every year to remind themselves of what it was to be a patriotic Scot.
There's a lot of debate on whether Arbroath influenced the Declaration of Independence, because the evidence is circumstantial. But one influential signatory of the American Declaration was James Wilson, who was educated in Cooper and at St Andrews, Glasgow and Edinburgh before migrating to America, where he was known as James of Caledonia. To my ears, his address to the inhabitants of the colonies in 1776 clearly echoes the sentiments of Arbroath. We wish for peace, we wish for safety, but we will not, to obtain either or both of them, part with our liberty. The sacred gift descended to us from our ancestors. We cannot dispose of it. We are bound by the strongest ties to transmit it, as we've received it, pure and inviolate, to our posterity.
I would say too that the Arbroath Declaration was hundreds of years ahead of its time, in that if the king were not suitable, they had the right to replace him with somebody who was, and that is a very American thing. You're allowed to change the president every 4 years. So that concept absolutely will have resonated with the Founding Fathers.
Yet if he should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we would strive at once to drive him out as our enemy and subverter of his own right and ours, and we would make some other man who was able to defend us our king.
The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it is the job of the government to protect those rights. And when the government usurps natural law, it has to be disciplined and corrected. And that's embedded in the Declaration of Arbroath. And the other point it made was that rulers hold their office at the will of the people, and they're accountable to the people. But this was a very, very astonishing thing at the time.
When were you first aware of the Declaration of Arbroath?
Not till quite late on. I mean, I knew about it before, but it was only when I got to the referendum for independence that I really got into the whole history of Scotland and how Scotland was. And then, of course, looking at the influence that Scotland had on America, particularly with the Scottish Enlightenment, and how certain of those guys were set books, and people like John Adams and people like that read them.
Brian Cox, Father George Rutler, and a reading from the Declaration by a pupil from Hayeshead Primary in Arbroath. Our Declaration was reprinted in 15 different books published before 1760 that were available to the signatories of the American Declaration in their early universities, influenced by the writing of the Scottish Enlightenment. Since then, the St Andrews Society of the State of New York has been embedded in the history of the nation. Richard James Porter.
In 1756, the St Andrews Society was established with Philip Livingston, the first president, who then went on to become one of the 3 members of the society who signed the Declaration of Independence. The organization was founded largely by fairly well-to-do Scots to assist not only widows and orphans and Scots who were on hard times, but even among themselves. The impetus was the philanthropy, as well as the national pride and the fellowship. They contributed greatly, and the Scottish Enlightenment was very important. The literacy rate of the Scots was the highest in all of the Old World, and as a result of that, the St Andrews Society members were instrumental in founding both Princeton and King's College, which is now Columbia.
The history of these organisations is astonishing. The enthusiasm, the pride, the passion they have in Scotland is something we could learn from back home.
Graham Day.
You're the MSP for Arbroath. How important is the declaration to you and to the town?
To me and the town, it's hugely important to come here this week and to discover the extent to which the American Scots really embrace the links between the Declaration of Arbroath and their Declaration of Independence. It's really heartening. It's quite moving, actually, and I think we need to raise awareness back home to the same sort of levels. It's a massively important document.
And do you feel it does promote Scotland?
Big time. Tartan Day is an official title. Tartan Week evolved, so the longest week we've had was 52 days. If I needed anything to be more proud of being Scottish, the fact that it was written, fabulous, that it was written in 1320, totally makes me even prouder to be Scottish than anything, because we've always been an egalitarian society, and to have a record of it from so many hundreds of years ago really makes you realise that Scotland has always got it. But other countries, it's taken centuries to catch up. Really proud of it.
One of my abiding memories is a group of Fulbright students coming over to Dundee, and we were taking them up to Arbroath, and once they had enough fish and chips in them, they then went off to the exhibition there, to the Declaration, and quietly but solemnly we had Star Spangled Banner being sung in Arbroath to celebrate. So in terms of a student body, it made a connection to a group of Americans who had come over to Scotland, and that has a certain power to it.
Graham Morton and Margaret Kennedy. In the final programme, I'll be looking at the legacy of the Declaration today, from Scotland to California.
My name is Andrew Walker. I left Scotland in 1985 and got into the silicon chip industry. I ended up in Silicon Valley about 25 years ago, and I started my own company. I decided to call it Skiltron Corporation. I named it after the battle formation used by the Scots during the Wars of Independence, because it was supposed to be an innovation from a relatively weak power that's initially defensive but can be turned into an attacking formation that would ultimately lead to success. When I designed the company's silicon chip, I included the text from the Declaration of Arbroath in both Latin and English on the chip itself. The text is small enough that it can fit across the width of a human hair. The reason I chose to put that on the chip was, to me, the Declaration is a symbol for persistence, perseverance, and independence.